I am Alex Hopper, and this is my presentation on how I would consider Edward Casaubon to be, by himself, one of the most major inciting incidents in the book Middlemarch. So, a little bit of background on who he is, how he's regarded in Middlemarch, because that's quite important for the book, is how characters know each other, really. Celia, in chapter 2, very beginning of the book, really, just straight up says how very ugly he is. And not just referring to his physical appearance, but also his, dare I say, his methodology, how he carries himself throughout life. He's considered an intellectual, but most people aren't super fond of him because he's kind of a more shut-in type. He just kind of does his own thing, does the bare minimum to be considered respected. And so he is. People will talk about his position, they'll talk about what he does and say that favorably, but they won't really talk about how he is as a person when they're talking about him. And his major contributions to the story really are, in essence, marrying Dorothea and then subsequently dying. So he never really does much, really, that actually contributes to the plot other than hurting Dorothea in the marriage and then dying. But we'll get a little more into that right now. So, in life, as I said, this is about how Casaubon is the inciting incident, how he's a driver in the big events of the book. So, I want to go into 3 events that happened during his life and because he was alive that were fairly big events in the book and that had cascading consequences later on. So we'll start with Will. Without them going to Rome, Will may not have even fallen in love with Dorothea at all. And obviously they get married at the end of the book, so that's important. Dorothea's marriage also leads to James and Cecilia getting together. So, and finally, the sickness brings Casaubon's sickness later in his life brings Will to Middlemarch, and that has drastic consequences that we'll get into when we get to that. So, let's get right into it. So, before Rome, Dorothea had only met Will once. So they didn't really know each other, and this was before the marriage too. This was at the engagement party, if I'm remembering correctly. And chapter 20, the chapter after they first meet, basically, and Will is reminded of who she is. Basically, he appreciates her and determines that she is an angel beguiled by Casaubon, and she's sort of trapped in this cage of this marriage. And Will is justifiably concerned. He in fact says she must have made some original romance for herself in this marriage. That Mr. Casaubon had been a dragon who had carried her off to his lair with his talons simply and without legal forms. It would have been an unavoidable feat of heroism to release her and fall at her feet. Basically, he's saying Casaubon has bound Dorothea, locked her away, but Will, because of the legal nature of marriage, cannot really help fix the problem. And so that leads to raising a tension we see later, and later on, especially after his death. So moving on to Celia and James. James kind of lets Celia go unnoticed in this shadow of Dorothea, I suppose, because he only notices her when Dorothea's gone, when there's no chance anymore, because Dorothea's married. So, in the beginning, James is quite infatuated with Dorothea, as this quote goes from chapter 2. He thought it probable that Miss Brooke liked him, and manners must be very marked indeed before they cease to be interpreted by preconceptions either confident or distrustful. That is from chapter 2, and that's at the very beginning of the book. James thinks that he's already won, and then Dorothea goes and marries Casaubon, and that sort of dream is shattered. So Dorothea leaves to go to Rome. There are, in that group that we get established at the beginning of James, Celia, and Dorothea, only two of them are left. James and Dorothea. James and Celia, sorry. And realizing Dorothea wasn't there no more and couldn't be married to James anymore, they end up getting engaged while Dorothea is away, without even sending a letter or nothing, because, at the time it's kind of hard. And Celia will say in chapter 28, "It was because you went away, Dodo. Then there was nobody but me and Sir James to talk to." And Celia, sorry, I keep getting them confused. Celia will says this kind of flighting, not snarky. The word I'm looking for is lighthearted, right? But it just goes to show that, without Dorothea physically leaving the space, that relationship might not have happened, and that didn't happen. That only happened because Casaubon married Dorothea, thus making him basically the facilitator of this marriage, unironically. And finally, we go to Will. Probably the most important thing that Casaubon sort of incited in his life, because this really cascades into the later parts of the book, especially in regards to characters like Bulstrode. Basically, if he never got sick, Will wouldn't have showed up, because when he got sick, Mr. Brooke wrote him a letter asking him to come, likely against Casaubon's actual wishes, but if he wouldn't have been there, Casaubon wouldn't sit. And also, that return also has a connection to Dorothea too, because Mr. Brooke wouldn't have been the one writing that letter if it was just Casaubon. So, Will's return after this letter likely was the thing that motivated Casaubon to put the codicil in his will that prevented Dorothea from having the property that she was going to be inheriting, unless she stayed away from Will, basically. So to demonstrate this, in chapter 48, when Will shows up in their church, basically, in Lawwick Church, the narrator states, "Will was banished further than ever, for Mr. Casaubon must have been newly embittered by this thrusting upon him of a presence which he refused to recognize." Basically, Casaubon did not want Will around. In so doing this, he writes his will, and he does something quite spiteful with it, which we'll get more into when we talk about it after his death. If Will never returns, however, Bulstrode is never exposed. Raffles really only got the motivation to do something to Bulstrode when he confirmed that Will was Sarah Dunkirk's son. So, without Will returning, Bulstrode might have never left Middlemarch, might have lent the money to Lydgate, and it would have been no problem. Maybe never lent the money to Lydgate in the first place. And that comes back later on, so we'll get right to that. So now we talk about what happens after his death, near his death, and how those events sort of cascade into the end of the book. So obviously, if you've read the book, you will know that Will has basically been forced to separate from Dorothea, or else Dorothea will lose all the inheritance she got from Casaubon, which includes an estate, stipends, that sort of deal. And Dorothea's inheritance leads to Fred's employment under Caleb Garth. We'll get into more details on that later, because that's a pretty long chain of events, but it's directly related to Casaubon's will. It also enables Dorothea to help Lydgate and Rosamund. So really, the best thing that Casaubon did for Middlemarch was dying, apparently. Of course, other than that first point, right? So, the dead hand that is Casaubon's will that was forcing Will and Dorothea apart was a terrible thing. But it broke what little devotion Dorothea had left for Casaubon that she held in her heart. In chapter 50, Dorothea kind of has a moment, as it were, after she hears of the clause in the will. The grasp had slipped away, bound by a pledge given from the depths of her pity. She would have been capable of undertaking toil which her judgment whispered was vain for all uses except for that consecration of faithfulness which is the supreme use. Basically, she gave up. She was like, this isn't worth it anymore. I can't do this. And so she threw it all away. Of course, at this point, she still didn't know what to do with herself after Casaubon's death, because she thought Casaubon was going to tell her that, and that never happened. And then obviously we move on to Will. Will, in order to protect Dorothea, drastically shifts his priorities. And from what I'm able to understand from the story, is that he would have left if it wasn't for him entrenching himself in Middlemarch's politics by his associations with Mr. Brooke. In chapter 51, as follows, there were plenty of reasons why he should not go. Public reasons why he should not quit his post at this crisis, leaving Mr. Brooke in the lurch when he needed coaching for the election, and when there was so much canvassing, direct and indirect, to be carried on. Basically, the only reason he was able to justify himself staying is because he had so many responsibilities in Middlemarch. But he had to shift his priorities away from Dorothea, and he even says that he can't really go into the estate because it would be politically disadvantageous for him right before that in chapter 51. So, alright, so now that we've talked about the effect of the will on both Dorothea and Will directly, let's talk about how the inheritance caused some interesting cascading effects going down the road, right, to certain outcomes that I think are genuinely positive. So Dorothea inherits the estate, right, because she doesn't immediately go off and marry Will. She follows the will and gets the estate and her stipend. In chapter 56, we get a series of events which essentially lead to Fred Vincy falling under the employ of Caleb Garth. And that has more effects that we'll get to in a minute. And it goes as follows. Dorothea, reasonably, after Caleb Garth basically approving the cottages that Dorothea wanted for a long time. At the beginning of the book, she mentions them. She entrusts Caleb Garth to sort of help her work with the railroad people, essentially, because they're coming from outside of Middlemarch, and she doesn't really know how to deal with them, so she gets Garth to do it, basically. This assistance puts Garth and his assistant in danger from some people who are not happy about the railway coming to Middlemarch and basically cutting up the area, messing some stuff up, changing things, essentially. Fred, who's passing by on his horse, he's riding around, finds them and drives off the attackers. It's just kind of a chance encounter thing. And Garth's employee, his assistant, is injured in this attack. So Fred offers to help him because, Fred's a decent enough guy. He's happy to help the Garths, especially since he owes the Garths for helping him before, and he caused injury to them, financially speaking. And this employment, eventually, at the end of the book, leads him to being the steward of the Stone Court. And that's how he ends up with Mary. So without Dorothea inheriting the estate, we might not have seen Fred and Mary get married. it's one of those things where you can't really be sure about, because I don't know if Casaubon would have asked Garth for the help or if he would have just done it himself. It's just one of those things that it's so long away you can't really see the tie, but it all ties back to Casaubon. That's why I made this. So the next thing I want to talk about is Lydgate, obviously, because Dorothea helps Lydgate too. And this comes after Bulstrode's exposure as being a not so good guy, and basically stealing an inheritance. But Lydgate wanting to distance himself from Bulstrode because he had taken money, and then it's announced that Raffles dies, which is not a good social state to be in. Everyone thinks that he's cooperated in that murder. Dorothea, after hearing of Lydgate's plight and Lydgate being honest with her about how he was and how his marriage was going right now and what his state was, decides, I'm gonna give him the money so that he can give Bulstrode back his money so he can cut ties with Bulstrode and not have to worry about it. This is when she's about to write the note that would make that happen. She sat down at once under the inspiration of their interview and wrote a brief note in which she pleaded that she had more claim than Mr. Bulstrode had to the satisfaction of providing the money which had been serviceable to Lydgate, that it would be unkind in Lydgate not to grant her the position of being his helper in this small matter, the favor being entirely to her who had so little that was plainly marked out for her to do with her superfluous money. Basically, she had too much money, didn't know what to do with it, and this was something to do with it, so she decided to help out. This basically saved Lydgate from being tied to Bulstrode. The suspicion still lingered, but ultimately giving the money you took back from a guy after he got exposed as being kind of unpleasant, having an unpleasant past, as it were, kind of allowed Lydgate and Rosamund to mend a little and basically live out the rest of their lives. Of course, Lydgate dies fairly young and Rosamund runs off and marries again, but ultimately they do end on relatively okay terms instead of the pure hostility we see right before this moment where Rosamund's like, oh, you're associated with Bulstrode, we gotta leave, we gotta run away, and all that. So basically, through Casaubon's wealth, she managed to sort of help protect some people, and I think that's quite important, right? It changes the ending basically into a much more tragic thing. So, in conclusion, Casaubon is a lot more important than we give him credit for. Obviously not in a great way, right? His part in the will and him being sort of I want to say jealous. You don't go near this guy again in your will if you're not particularly jealous of that person. But that's sort of why I call him an inciting incident. Like, his actions allowed others to make moves that they normally couldn't. Basically, he took a part in, at least by proxy, he took part in every major event in the story, whether it was him or his money or his property, right? So that just goes to show how connected Middlemarch is. It shows how Eliot is such a masterful writer that something that you kind of forget about is that that Casaubon is the reason why Dorothea has money. Casaubon is the reason why Will has to go do the things he does. It helps us understand how even the smallest things in Middlemarch might be connected to something way bigger. And that Middlemarch is really a summation of events, an interconnected web of both people and occurrences. And that's what makes it such a masterful piece of literature. Thank you for your time, and have a good day.